Thank you so much for joining us. Early in the morning, I know that many of you may have gone to the even earlier sessions. I'm going to guess that for many of you, this is the first session of the day. It's also the first time I've ever been on a panel, either as moderator or speaker, that has started on time. So we're already ahead of the game today. Thank you so much for joining us for what I believe will be a fascinating conversation about innovation across Asia. We are joined by some of Asia's preeminent entrepreneurs who have all played a hand in shaping the arc of innovation and the pursuit of change via technology across many different countries in Asia. I'm excited to be your moderator today. My name is Gary Liu. I'm the CEO of the South China Morning Post. I think most of these gentlemen here do not need introductions, but very quickly from the far left to the right, we have Hua Fung Teh, who is the group president for One Championship, which is a martial arts media company, martial arts sports media company. It's many things, and we'll let Hua Fung talk about that later. Then we have Teddy Oetomo, who is the chief strategy officer of the Indonesian e-commerce unicorn, Bukalapak. We have Ming Maa, who is the president of the ride-sharing giant Grab. And then to my right, we have Tony Hang, who is the co-founder and CEO of WeRide. It's an autonomous vehicle company. And then Dr. Swan Gin Beh, who is the chairman of the Singapore Economic Development Board. This really is an incredible group of folks. I'm excited that all of you guys are here. Thank you for joining me. For the sake of introduction, Asia as a marketplace has significantly changed in not only its investment profile, but in the prevalence of large, impactful, world-changing technology companies in really just the last few years. At this point in time, about a third of the world's unicorn startups are based in Asia. Now, granted, a big chunk of those are from one single country, from China. About 25% of the world's unicorns are now based in China versus 50% still in the United States. But that profile really has changed in just the last couple of years. In just the last 2 years alone, the number of unicorns in Asia has grown by about 60%. Now, investment dollars in Asia have also really caught up to that of the United States. In 2017, 40% of about $154 billion in global venture financing came from Asia, compared to 44% in the United States. And in 2019, even though China's economy is starting to slow, and we expect that this year China's economy will grow at about 6% or just a little bit over, Asia's growth trajectory continues at about 5% overall, which is higher than the overall global average. So we're going to talk through a few key themes today, but I want to start with what I believe to be the most important one, which is to dispel this myth that is oft repeated in the US when we talk about Asia, that Asia is a single monolithic marketplace. It, of course, is not. It is made up of so many different markets with so many different types of consumer behavior, so many different relationships with governance, with policy, with trade relations. It is a complex but extremely vibrant market, and so much of the world's leading edge innovation is now originating from this marketplace. So I would like to start off with a series of questions for our panelists to allow this group to better understand the intricacies, the complexities, and the differences in the developing Asian markets. So with that, I want to start with Dr. Beh, Swan Gin. Across the region, you have purview. You're based in Singapore, and you run Singapore's Economic Development Board, but you have purview, and you get to view across Southeast Asia and the rest of Asia as well, many different countries, many different marketplaces. Can you lead us off by talking about some of the key differences you see from market to market and how we should be viewing Asia as a whole?
Well, thank you, Gary. I think to start off with, if we were to try and simplify Asia, you would already immediately think of three growth engines, right? You think of China, you think of India, and you think of Southeast Asia. And China is a continental economy. You can approach China the way you approach the US. And eventually you can approach India the way you approach the US. But Southeast Asia today, US $2.8 trillion economy, probably the 6th largest economy in the world today. It is comprised of 10 separate countries, very different markets. And many of my panel members here will be able to explain the intricacies of Asia. But you would see both extremely affluent urban centers like Singapore, like Bangkok, like Kuala Lumpur. But then you will also see the vibrancy of middle-class emerging economies who are fast growing the middle class. And I think that's the interesting thing about Southeast Asia. It's not just the differences between countries, but it's also the differences between the customer segments. I mean, many companies in the US and Europe are familiar with the middle class here. This is really consumer demand in the developed economies have really powered the growth since 1960, right, of many of these companies. And over the last 2 decades, the affluent in Asia has also joined the consumer demand for these products. But going forward, if you think about how middle class in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular, will grow from roughly about 50-odd% today to account for about 65% of global middle class, that's the market opportunity that you will want to address. But middle class in Asia is defined as US $10,000 to $15,000 household income per year. That's poverty line here. But middle class means discretionary spending power, which means a lot of unmet needs, and the unmet needs will be different in Philippines. Unmet needs will be different in Indonesia and Thailand. So yes, country by country differences, but also customer segment differences. And I thought I would just lead off with that particular point.
Thank you, Swan Gin. We will come back to the middle class question because it is such a primary growth driver that we expect over the course of the next decade across Asia. I do want to turn now to Ming. Now, Grab is well known for being hyper-localized from market to market. So I'd love to hear from your experience the differences of how your business operates from country to country.
Sorry. First of all, thank you for having me here. My voice is recovering from last night, so excuse the cough. It's hard to think about any real commonalities between the different countries because the consumer expectations, preferences are just so distinct market by market. I see many colleagues here from Singapore, and I think most of you would agree with me that Singaporeans, for example, tend to be very, very demanding. Whereas Indonesians may be less demanding. And the way that this gets expressed in startups and companies take very many different forms. For example, when you think about the notion of ride sharing, most companies would think of ride sharing as defined in a very narrow scope of a car. But in certain countries like Philippines or Thailand, the number of consumers taking motorcycles or these 3-wheel tuk-tuks, these are lawnmower engine type vehicles, outnumber the number of consumers taking 4-wheel transport. And so we went to the markets, we said, well, why would you want to force a consumer to take a different service than what they are expected or really understand and feel comfortable with? Rather, why don't we customize the service for the vehicle format that makes sense? And that's one very simple example. Another simple example is simply that infrastructure availability is completely different among countries. You have crazy rich Asians on one end of the spectrum, you have slumdog millionaires on the other, and the infrastructure is as diverse. So payments, as an example now. We've now built the largest regional payment mobile wallet in Southeast Asia. But the infrastructure that was provided to us in Singapore, very distinct from what was available in Indonesia, where there's no ACH, there's no SWIFT. And so you're able to then recreate the entire payment infra from the ground up. And I think that's frankly what provides and what creates the opportunities for very vibrant startup opportunity, because you're not constrained by the last 50 years of history and built up of infrastructure. And that creates a lot of creative freedom for us to move.
There are a few very interesting topics that Ming brought up that we will also revisit, from infrastructure growth to serving underserved populations in Asia, which has become an enormous market opportunity and actually is driving a good amount of innovation across the region. I want to now turn to Tony on my right. Now, the China marketplace is very distinct. I think that most people here are familiar with the scale and the complexity of the China market. Let me ask from your point of view what it looks like to birth, especially cutting-edge technology in China right now. When you think about WeRide and the opportunity for growth for WeRide, are you thinking only of domestic market, and are you thinking only of the use case of the single market, or are you thinking globally already?
Okay, great question. A little bit history about our company. Our company is a 2-year-old startup, which was founded in Silicon Valley. But 8 months later, we decided to move back to China. Why? Because in US, there's lots of giants already there, startups, like big companies like Waymo and Cruise, you name it. But in China, we see the competition is not that intensive. At the same time, we know more market about China. The other thing we want to emphasize is about the tendency in China. Like we land our headquarters in Guangzhou. You know how many college graduate students in Guangzhou, the only city? It's 1 million. 1 million. It's just like a population of a size of a mid-sized city. And that means we have 250 college graduates every year. And we can select 1 of 1,000 to get this talent. And so we find like we have such good growth rate, and we have such so fast technology development speed. We have to credit this to the our huge pool of very well educated talents. And the other thing is about the policy, and I would say both China and the US are two great nations. They want to use innovation to drive the development of the economy. I just came back from Boao Forum, something like that. I find that two terms are kind of shared terms. I call this Milken Institute conference and Boao Forum conference. One is innovation technology. The other is shared property. So I would say shared prosperity. So I would say if I go to, we find like China is just definitely a great place for us to start up our shared autonomous driving technology and use it to the ride share and the car hailing market.
The regulatory frameworks, both incentivizing and sometimes disrupting innovation, another topic that we will hopefully be able to cover in our hour together. I'm going to jump now to Hua Fung. Now, One Championship is, like I said at the start, many things. And I'll let you explain a little bit about how you guys describe yourself. But above all, it is a media company, and media is generally borderless. Yes. Yet, the creation of media, how you create media and how you distribute media from market to market is very distinct. Yep. So from your experience, I'd love for you to tell us what that experience has been across Asia and, of course, all over the world now as One Championship continues to grow.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Sorry, Gary, I called you Robin.
That was my predecessor, SCMP,
whom I knew as well.
Who clearly has left very, very big shoes that I cannot fill.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, like you said, we're a global media company based out of Singapore. Asian obviously is our domicile and our core market, but we are broadcast in 140 countries. Like you said, media is borderless. As long as you can create content that resonates with a market, you can be in that market without even having to have an event. We signed an 8-figure rights deal in the US to have our content broadcast on TNT and BR Live with Turner Sports. So like you said, Asia, I mean, when you were just talking about the topic and introducing it, I just sort of started thinking about all the different things we have to do in all these different countries to succeed and to grow a business. It all starts with consumer preferences, as all of you know, right? Like you said, Ming, Crazy Rich Asians on one end, Slumdog Millionaire on the other end. And I think content, in a content business, we see very similar things. In some countries, our core base of international style content, if you haven't watched it, please watch it. You can download our app. It's called One Championship. We're the largest martial arts promotion in Asia and the largest sports media property in Asia by reach. And our content that has a relatively international flavor, just as the NBA, the NFL, the UFC, does well in countries that are used to importing, Western-style content. Philippines is a good example of one country like that. Singapore is a good example of a country like that, right? So we don't have to modify or do a lot to our content in these countries. In some countries, however, they're culturally very specific and idiosyncratic. Japan is a good example. So in Japan, we have a core base of live events, but we also do like a highly localized Japanese magazine show, right, to appeal to the local consumers. We're doing the same thing in China. We're doing the same thing in Indonesia. And that has real operational implications, right, because it means that you have to raise a local production team, right, with video editors and local creative talent. Whereas in some countries, you don't have to do that. The other thing I'd add about sort of trying to navigate different countries in Asia is the market entry process tends to be very different. I will tell you that in some countries, I tend to spend a lot of time with government officials. You know, this morning when I woke up, an official from Indonesia, for instance, was messaging me about what time I was going to arrive on Friday for our event because he wants to talk about some things. In some countries, we have to spend a lot of time with government agencies and officials. In some countries like Singapore, where approval processes are very simple, we focus a lot more on the business. Some countries have the BATs, big, distribution partners that tend to govern the cause of events, right, in a big way. We have to invest a lot of time with those partners in those countries. So every single country has a very different sort of setup and market entry approach.
Thank you. And then, Teddy, Indonesia is such a complex market. Not only is it a country that is of thousands of islands, and the complexity of just even logistics in the country are mind-blowing. But there are, from city to city, the consumer behavior is almost completely different. As an e-commerce giant, as an e-commerce business, what has it been like to scale a business that is relevant to all, but relevant in very, very different ways, even though it's a single market?
Yeah. So I think as Ming has put it, right, and everybody here has probably heard, the biggest problem of Indonesia is, you're right, one side you have a crazy rich Asian, and the other side you have this whole bunch of slumdog millionaires, right? And when we run our e-commerce, when we started, what we didn't probably back then, this is probably like 6-7 years ago, what we didn't realize is, hang on a minute, even as we see today, e-commerce of Indonesia penetrate about 5% of the population. There are 95% remaining, right? And so as Ming put it very well, you kind of have to find a way that attach and get yourself into where the mass market are. And they're very different one to the other. And for example, in Indonesia, 50% of the population is unbanked. Now, how are you going to transfer your money in e-commerce if you're unbanked? The remaining 50% that actually has a bank account, they don't even have a digital bank account, right? So one of the measures, for example, that we have done, actually we took that from one of your portfolio company as well, was to build into this channel of mom and pop kiosks across the country. And the logic was very different. It was very simple. You don't want to ask them to create something new. You don't want them to go out and have the new behavior, as what Ming has put. If they are used to be on, those tuk-tuk Moderator, why ask them to jump into a four-wheel car? So we realized that their daily behavior is transacting in this mom and pop kiosk. And you have to get to those mom and pop kiosks, because that's what they got used to. You have to be able to turn your business around so that it's somehow you can attract all your users based on this mom and pop kiosk. The problem, of course, is, for example, when it comes to regulatory and even data, right? When we first looked at this mom and pop kiosk, the main question that we asked is, how many mom and pop kiosks out there? We asked the government, and they said, oh, it's roughly about 4 million. And then within like 2 years, we tapped into like 750,000 of them. So I went back to the minister and I said, look, I've tapped into 750,000 out of the 4 million. He said, yeah. I said, yeah. He said, well, there's a problem. And I said, what's the problem? Then the number was wrong. It's not 4 million. Because there's no way you tap into it so fast, right? And that's true, because apparently 4 million are the amount that's registered by the government that they know of. And there's probably like 10 times more that I have no idea about, because, hey, there's somebody's house in the village, for example, that they decided to turn it around, open the window, big window, and becomes a kiosk, right? So how do you tap into a lot of these spaces where you don't have the information? That's when you have to understand the local behavior very well. Like 95% to 99% of our employees are Indonesian. We try as much as we can not to recruit expats, because to understand Indonesia, you need somebody very, very local, as it is. I came from Java. I would not understand the tradition of somebody in Sulawesi. So when we expand to Sulawesi, we needed somebody that understands that behavior there. So in Indonesia, is I think probably added that complexity because even this one country, it makes up like 10,000 islands, it makes up of like 10,000 different culture. So you kind of need to understand every one of them one by one.
Excellent, thank you. Now, we started off by talking about the speed at which the Asia technology space, innovation, of course, capital investment has grown over the course of the last couple of years. I want to ask about the contributing factors to that. What has contributed to the accelerated success of technology and innovation across the region? I want to start with Ming here. Is it a combination of access to capital, access to scale? Is it talent? Is it a work culture? What are the things that have come together to accelerate this marketplace, this overall marketplace, but also individual marketplaces, so quickly in the last few years?
Gary, actually, if you don't mind, I thought I should just interject to try and wrap up the earlier segment about Asia being monolithic, because the audience might then wonder, if Asia is so fragmented, why should they bother? Right? If Southeast Asia is so fragmented, why should they bother? And I'll just share two reasons why you might want to bother. The first is just the sheer potential, at least in Southeast Asia, 650 million population that's growing consistently for the past decade at 5%. And we all know that the potential for growth is actually much higher. But despite all the political changes that you may hear in Southeast Asia, consistently 5% for the last 10 years and going forward, right? So that's the first reason, just the sheer potential. EU today is what, 350 million people or so. Asia at 650 million in 20 years will be a way bigger market opportunity. Second is technological disruption. It is making possible single companies to serve disparate markets, mass customization, mobile communication technology, to be able to achieve the unit costs to be able to serve the different markets efficiently and profitably. So I thought I should just add these 2 points, that despite the fact that the consumer preferences may be very different in the different countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, it is still worth your while to invest in the opportunities there.
I think that's a perfect lead-in to the question I asked Ming. And on top of all of that, the reality is that hopefully, even from the intros, you got a sense that if you're looking for localization experts, hyper-localization experts, anywhere in the world, Asia is certainly the place where you'll find the executives, the product people, the strategists who really understand how to take single product and single platform and make it relevant to disparate populations in a way that can actually scale. So Ming, if you can follow on to what Swan Gin said, what are the other factors beyond access to scale and the advantages of single platform that have led to this explosion in growth?
Yeah, I think a couple of comments. First of all, I think there is a popular narrative, I think, out on the financial community that perhaps Southeast Asia is overcapitalized. There's been too much capital coming in to the markets in various different forms. And one thing I'll just make a note of is investors are extremely savvy. Investors are extremely smart. And at the end of the day, the capital is the tail wagging the dog. It's not the dog. Capital is coming into the markets because, as Rajiv mentioned yesterday, there's a tremendous amount of courage now in the markets to create, to find and create opportunities that weren't there 5-10 years ago. And I think the reaction from the investment community to this large opportunity, exactly to Mr. Beh's point, is exactly a reaction to that. I think technology is a wonderful deflationary powerhouse. Every year, services get cheaper and cheaper, to a point now where we would argue the last billion of consumers in Southeast in the region, in the world, now have access to the same services, the same digital services that the first billion digital consumers now have in the US and Europe and in developed markets. And that's amazing. You can buy a smartphone for $49 in Indonesia, not with 2 terabytes of memory, but you can get one for 128 megabytes of memory, and it does everything that your Apple does. And I think the ability to tap into that last billion of consumers is so powerful because many of these consumers, many of these individuals are working in the informal economy. to your point earlier, they're not getting a W-2. They don't pay taxes. They don't have access to bank credit or credit cards in the formal sense that we all think about. And they are truly invisible, I think, to a lot of the government statistics, to the way that we approach them. But they contribute. They're incredibly productive parts of the economy. And if you're able to unlock that informal economy and bring these individuals into the formal economy, you make them visible. They're able to get credit for the first time. And that, I think, is a massive opportunity that if you are able to unlock in an appropriate and, more importantly, in a very durable way that is not driven by subsidies or driven by short-term incentives that creates very strange behaviors in the market, then I think these are massive market opportunities that are worthwhile pursuing.
And this is a pattern that we see repeated across Asia. The fact that innovation oftentimes is driven because there is an enormous underserved population to be served, and so it has led to leapfrog technologies. This is very, very evident, especially in China. Education startups have been exploding over the course of the last few years because it is an enormous marketplace. There is, by last account, nearly 60 million rural students now that are accessible by the internet, that have no access, or at the very least limited access, to high caliber education, primary school education. And so that as a marketplace is larger than the entirety of the American student market from kindergarten all the way through to grade 12. That can be addressed, and therefore $1 billion of private investment and another $20 billion in state investment dedicated to this one sector of the industry. And again, repeated across multiple different industries. And I do want to turn to Tony here about what defines this level of success, or what determines this level of success when we are thinking about underserved marketplaces and populations across China, which is, of course, a continental economy, as Swan Gin mentioned, not part of the 650 million population of growth, of course, another 1.4 billion on top of that. So Tony, I would love to hear your thoughts about what the underserved population looks like and how focus on that has driven innovation across China.
Okay, China is such a big country. As in a forum like yesterday, I heard from Joe Tsai and mentioned, I totally agree with that. In China, there are cities like San Francisco, like we call it Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. If you go there, you tell no difference between Tokyo and Guangzhou. It's all like the first-class world cities. There are third-tier, fourth-tier cities, and you go there, you probably think you found yourself maybe in Vietnam or Indonesia. There's motorcycles all everywhere. And to develop that kind of technology, our autonomous driving, motion planning, and decision algorithm may need to adapt to different cities. So it's such a unevenly developed part. So you have to really focus on the market, what you are trying to do. And give an example of our policy. Our strategies, we want to do the operation in the tier 1 city, that is Guangzhou, and we find another small city that's tier 3, just like Waymo has done in Phoenix, Arizona. We use 2 different strategies to do it. So for China, to really, you don't have one universal strategy that you can conquer the whole China, although it's in one continent. They share the same language, maybe share the same culture, but the developed are very different. So you have to think about it parts by parts. But what I want to say something that's in common, that is, it's about East Asian culture. In East Asian culture, the whole thing is the family pays lots of attention to the education to their young generation. They want to invest money to the young generation, and because of the traditional imperial examination system, students really work hard to get a good job. What does that mean? That means you can have a large pool of very well educated talents, and you want to develop new technology, you need to attract talents. So to that one, this kind of a good, we just work closely with local government to get some policy and to attract talents. So that's what our thoughts. So in overall in China, you won't find a universal strategy, but you have to look at the specific market and develop your technology.
It's often perilous to talk about culture as a reason for innovation growth, because we're making generalizations every time we talk about culture. Especially at this moment in time, actually, there's been this hoopla over the course of the last few weeks about the 996 culture in the Chinese tech industry. If you haven't heard about it, the West suddenly discovered that China had this concept called 996, which is to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And there was all sorts of, there was a lot of conversation inside of China about how that long-term could be detrimental to mental health and to employee happiness. And then a lot of conversation outside of China about how ridiculous that kind of working culture actually is. What most people forget, or actually probably didn't even know to begin with, is that 996 started off a few years ago as effectively a marketing slogan for companies that had work-life balance, because they were comparing themselves to all the other companies that were 997. So on this concept of culture, I don't know if any of our leaders here on the panel want to take the perilous step to discuss whether or not there are strains within Asian culture, East Asian, Southeast Asian, whatever, that you believe have have added to the accelerated success of the tech industry growth over the course of the last decade.
By the way, I'll just jump in. So we just did a recruiting event in Beijing where we had a huge banner. The banner said, "Just say no to 996." That's been a massive success for us. We now have applications, up the stack. So thank you.
It's not 997, right?
Not 997. Okay. 997.
So Gary, may I jump into
Sure.
that? Because as a company, we have our headquarters located in Guangzhou, which is kind of have this kind of 996 culture discussion everywhere. And also we have a big R&D office in Silicon Valley, and we are using OKR and all Google stuff to drive our stuff. So basically, we are a small company, but have to accommodate two different cultures. I was a tenure professor at the University of Missouri. I find a very interesting phenomenon that is during the development of the childhood and our education, Asia and the US, they are too different. One before like ninth grade, US kids, American kids, they play and they enjoy life. And when they got into college, they work day and night and work really hard. But lots of Chinese generations, before high school, before college exam, we all experience this. You work like a dog, study every day, no entertainment. But once you get into the college, you somehow relax. So I just feel like it's just like, when do you start to really put your energy into in your whole life journey? Most of majority of the working force work at 996 during their like 30 or 40 years of working? I guess probably not. But the thing is, for the Chinese young generation, young people, they want to have a very good start, a boost at the beginning. So at the beginning, they want to work crazy like 996. There's lots of financial analysts, if you go to Morgan Stanley, if you go to McKinsey, they are not 996. They maybe start work at 8 and sleep at 11 p.m. and they work 7 days. But later, when you got established, they raise a family and they lean toward work-life balance. So it's just different way of how do you handle work-life balance in the long run, in long scale. Don't think all Chinese people are workaholic. They are not. So it's just different way of treating life and getting things done. Which one is better? I think we have to use a results-driven way to think about it. But I have a feeling that if it exists, there must be some rationale behind it. Don't think 996 is a dose of poison. I don't think so. And also, they don't require you to work 996. As Jack Ma mentioned in Alibaba, they want to inspire you to work as 996. It's illegal to ask people to work 996 in China.
Hua Fung?
Yeah, I'd like to build on Tony's point. I agree completely, right? Like, it's one thing to ask people to work 996 or 997. It's another, when people actually want to do it, regardless of what you ask, right? And I think, in fact, if anything, at One Championship, first of all, we're in the creative business, right? So you can't make too many rules for people when you're trying to come up with new ideas, and you're trying to be creative and trying to kind of inspire, right? So we don't actually have any sort of rules. We have no FaceTime in the office. You can work from home. In fact, if anything, we have a bigger challenge getting people to go home, getting people to spend time with their loved ones, because people are so passionate about what we're doing, right? So I think this also speaks to the opportunity that is ahead of all of us, right? I mean, Asia is at a stage of development where there is a big prize at the end. For some people, it's economic. For some people, it's to create, it's to create something. For some people, it's to inspire the next generation. And I think when countries are at that stage of sort of capital and enterprise formation, you naturally are going to get many, many people who want to, who are very passionate about what they're doing. And that's what we have at One Championship, right? We have a lot of people that love what we're doing. We're trying to build, Asia's first ever global sports media company. We want to be bigger than the NFL, and we think it's possible, right? Because Asia's a big place. And until we came along, no other sports media company had operated on a pan-Asian basis like us. Indian cricket is single country. Chinese basketball is single country. J-League in Japan is single country. We're all over Asia, and we're broadcast across the world. That's a big project. But because it's a big, interesting project, many people are inspired by that and want to put in the hours. So we actually have the reverse problem. We're always trying to tell people to take time off and spend time with their family.
If I can add,
Yeah,
I think one of the reasons is because, at least in a generation that's a bit younger than me, right? We still kind of grow up with this very Asian-minded education, right? Where you are asked to put in all the hours and you memorize things. That's how you're taught in the school. I remember when I was in school, the idea of school in Indonesia, for example, is the teachers tells you what to memorize and remember, and you do it. You don't ask questions, right? And even though, to some extent, a lot of people kind of think that's a disadvantage, it was actually quite interesting that in our company, at least, a lot of these young workers, when they come into a more creative kind of scope of aspect, they actually find it very liberating, right? Because it's the first time that we have a very strong culture of just speak up, for example, right? Like if you disagree, you can actually literally just go in a meeting and go against even the CEO and the founders, right? And they actually find that very, very liberating because they've never had that before. Of course, I mean, to balance that, the easy way for us at least to balance that is, we always have this kind of a layer of Indonesian that's been studying overseas, like the Stanford, the MIT, and all that, because they strike the balance from a very, I guess you can call it more traditional culture, right? And then they're trying to aspire to, and they show them that foreign educated, well-performed kind of student and young generation, this is how they do it, right? So it kind of like provide a mentorship as well to a lot of these young kids, and as a result, they actually love it. I mean, you're right. I mean, I've seen a guy that I had to tell him to go home because he sit on his desk for like 3 days and he didn't even take a shower, right? I got worried, right? That was extreme and bad case, I must say, right?
Yeah, totally understand what you mean. Yeah.
Well, Swan Gin, I do want to ask you, the EDB brings a lot of international companies to Singapore and certainly helps actually across Asia in that sense. What are some mistakes of non-Asian companies coming to establish in Asia? What are some of the mistakes that you have seen made when it comes to localization, either to single country or to the region?
Well, many of the Fortune 500 companies came into Southeast Asia, to Asia as a whole, as part of the strategy to create a global supply chain. I think that was Asia's value proposition in the 80s and the 90s. And somewhere in the 2000s, about 2005 or so, we saw that shift where increasingly the international companies were investing in Asia really to pursue the market opportunities in Asia. And I think that first decade, which was really to make sure that the products and services and solutions that the Fortune 500 companies already had could penetrate and win the market share of the affluent in Asia. I think we are at the stage right now, certainly in Singapore for the Economic Development Board, because we work so much with the Fortune 500 companies. We are working hard to persuade them that for the next stage, they really have to think hard about creating the sorts of products and solutions that Asian consumers, that their Asian customers want. really to address the unmet needs. I think many of you are familiar with stories about how, for instance, in Indonesia, at least 4 years ago, 8 in 10 were unbanked, right? 2% had credit cards, and to many Fortune 500 companies, they would say, I'll write off this market segment because it's just not worth my while. But with the economic growth that's taking place in Asia, more and more have discretionary spending power. So if you want to tap into that, you want to gain market share in that, you have to come up with the products that address that market segment. Because if they don't do that, 10 years from now, the ones who are dominating the markets in Asia will be Asian companies, will be innovators like this. So I wouldn't say that they are making mistakes, but they have to start thinking hard about having the right portfolio of products and services to address the opportunities in Asia.
Okay. So Andrea, I might have just set you up because I asked you to tell entrepreneurs and company leaders what they could be doing better. And we're going to lead directly now into the second section of our conversation, which is, I think, these folks having opinions about how the government could be doing better in incentivizing and driving innovation. Of course, throughout Asia, governance is very, very different from country to country. It's extremely complicated. But there is a central thread that governments have been, most of the governments that we see in ASEAN and certainly in China as well, have been spending a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money driving growth in the technology sector because, frankly, these governments believe that this will be the growth channel and growth engine for their countries in the decades to come. Now, it's largely participation, and of course, sometimes can be interpreted as intervention. So I do want to ask about both sides of this coin, and I want to start with Ming. Both you and Grab in general have talked a lot about nation building, about participating in nation building along with governments, how the platform of Grab and everything that you are trying to build is meant to be part of the lattice of new economy in nation building exercise. Can you expand on that and talk a little bit about how you work with governance and how governments have helped or maybe potentially inhibited growth of Grab across Southeast Asian countries?
Sure. So first of all, I would say governments are very different. Particularly in Southeast Asia, we work with communist governments, we work with socialist governments, we work with democratic governments, and everyone is very different in how they approach the markets. I would say one handicap that startups have versus the big international companies is governments in general, I think, still haven't internalized the notion that you can create local winners. And I say that with a little bit of sadness, unfortunately, because the notion is, well, if you're FANG, you will bring more jobs into the region, more technology. If you're Intel or IBM, we should support them with tax breaks or real estate, because that will ultimately uplift the economy. But I think what many governments are missing is, well, there are many local champions now that are doing that at even faster scale, faster velocity than the international companies. So that's one push to the governments in the region would be to recognize what we already have in the region. I think the second is many times it's more effective to work with not the government themselves, but the pseudo public institutions. So for example, outside of Jakarta, there's a very large development called BSD, which was developed by the Sinarmas Group, and its entire, I think the land mass is larger than many small cities here, Singapore. And their problem to us was, or the challenge they had was, if they really want to develop that as a dense urban population, the government of Indonesia, they can't depend on the government to provide all of the infrastructure, the railways, the mass transport. Because if they waited, they would be waiting for another 20, 30 years. So what do you do? So we went to Sinarmas and we said, well, why don't we recreate that pseudo-public infrastructure for you? And we can do that at a private company speed, at public project costs. And that's really the best of both worlds. So we're putting in place mass transport options for BSD. where we're getting as close as possible to the cost point of public transport, but serviced by a private company. So those are examples of how I think we can really work well together with private enterprises that are really mimicking the effect of working with public governments. I will give a shout out to Singapore because I think in the world of autonomous, Singapore has been the most forward-thinking about putting in place not just the opportunity to try the service, but then also the regulatory risk framework on risk sharing, whether it's insurance or whether it's liability management. And that I think is a good example where you can be very, very forward-thinking and create the path for companies to then start innovating within that. The last thing I'll mention is I think the notion of nation building is all around how do you bring this informal economy participants into the formal economy. Because as you know, in Indonesia, many people have multiple IDs. It's not, you don't have a driver's license, you have 3 different driver's licenses. Nobody pays taxes. A few people pay taxes. I pay my share, by the way. So if you help the government reach those individuals through private companies like the companies here, where we create formal economy income opportunities, bring them into the system where they're not necessarily being regulated now by the banking system or credit card companies, but they're part of the financial markets now. I think that creates a very good, I think, dialogue with governments and helps align the interests together.
I mean, since you brought up Singapore, the Singapore government's willingness to experiment with and invest in things like cutting-edge technologies like automation, autonomous vehicles. I want to jump now to Tony, and we all know that in China, there's a very unique relationship between private enterprise, especially startups, and government regulation. And especially in your world that is largely dependent on regulatory frameworks that allow you to test, allow you to really invest in that specific type of R&D. I would love for you to express to us a little bit more about what that relationship looks like, and has it been one that has driven innovation or inhibited?
I would say overall, as driving the innovation, I would say, as Mr. Tong mentioned in the last forum, the Chinese government as a whole is very, very effective. Like, just give an example about doing autonomous driving test regulation. At the beginning, they know nothing about autonomous driving, and they know they need to do it for several reasons, which I will elaborate a little bit later. But the thing is, okay, what should I do? One day I was traveling in the US, and at 3 a.m. I got a phone call from Beijing, and it's a very high-level ranking officer just asking me, hey, Tony, we want to do this. Do you have any suggestions? How should we do that? We want to set a regulation. I said, okay, there's some experience in California I can share because we just successfully got the testing permit in California. Here's what's the Californian policy. And they said, thank you very much. And they write it down. And 1 month later, boom, there's this announcement. And all my suggestions, it's very, very, there's several paragraphs directly just my suggestions. So you will find out they pinpoint entrepreneurs and move very, very fast. So if the direction is correct, it's very, very efficient. The other thing I want to say is in China for the innovation, they really know exactly the problems. I talk with many China government officials. They are not a kind of group of people with a bureaucratic policy maker or something. No, they are a group of people full of wisdom. They are a group of smart guys. I always mention, had this guy not go to government official, they want to be CEOs. I would be in much trouble. They are so smart. A lot of things you speak like 1 or 2 sentences, they understand immediately what the key point is. Okay, I want you to talk to them, really talk to them. Okay, and later I find out they know the China population is aging, and they can't find so many taxi drivers in the China developed cities, and they know autonomous driving is the future. And I gave them books. They really read them. They read the books about technology. I met them once every month or quarter. A quarter later, I find they really read your books, they read articles, and they ask you questions. So in that sense, I do think the whole policymaker and also the policy and regulations they make really helps us a lot, especially in autonomous driving. Without local government support, we won't succeed.
Thank you. Teddy, in a previous conversation, you had mentioned that there's a very unique relationship in Indonesia between politicians and millennials. And again, as a consumer-forward technology company, of course, you care about consumption behaviors of millennials, and therefore the relationship that you have with government is somewhat defined by that. Can you expand for the audience there?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people in the Western world typically that speaks to has this question about how is the regulatory framework, is the government support or against technological advancement. Now, I'll just point out a very clear, simple pictures, right? 40% of Indonesian population is millennials. Millennials love tech. Government people got elected by votes. If they want the votes, they have to support the policy, right? And we saw that probably in the past 3 months, because I don't know if any of you heard about it, but the government came out and trying to come up with these measures to tap into number of people that are not paying tax, right? And they were trying to use marketplace because their logic is like people like us, for example, because we tapped into like so many mom and pop kiosks that they know that a lot of our user probably doesn't pay tax. And on top of that, their user, which on monthly basis transacting probably about 15 million people transacting against 10 million people that's recorded in the e-commerce overall, right? They know that there's a lot of room for them to increase the number of taxpayers just by tapping into information of a company like us, right? Having said that, we spoke to them probably for like 2 weeks. That's about all it took us, like all three of us. That's including Tokopedia and everybody else. So our logic is very simple. It was like, look, this is like a starting point, right? If you're starting to impose all this regulation now, then you're going to hinder it. And literally with that one sentence, practically to say, let us loose so that at least we can expand and do a lot better things for the country. Because a lot of the stuff we do, as what Ming has put it, was tapping into the previously informal sector. And that's huge, right? And that's the key, as what was said before, to bring this country from the slumdog millionaire kind of bunch into kind of like the middle segment, because you need to be able to bring this segment up through technology. And literally within like few meetings, they canceled the whole initiative. So that was kind of, I think, unheard of if you're in a country like Indonesia, for the government to step up and impose a regulation, and literally within counts of weeks, after a conversation with the private sector, they actually took a step back. It's very rare that you see an Asian regulator actually reverse their decision. And they literally, the Minister of Finance came out and said, look, I'm just going to cancel the whole thing, right? So, yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's whether either they recognize the need of technology to spur economic growth and being the engine to bring a lot of the country's kind of lower segment into middle segment, or simply just for the votes, right? But you see a very kind of supportive regulatory framework in at least Indonesia.
Now, yeah, Hua Fung, I want to throw it to you because you've been on both sides
Yeah.
of this discussion, both in government and as well as a corporate leader here. In media, of course, government has a lot of media in many ways is an expression of soft power of any country, of its creator. How has, in your experience, government participated well or not well in allowing media to be the expression of soft power for nations?
Yeah. I'd say that I have a slightly different approach when it comes to thinking about government and dealing with governments. Maybe it's because I spent some time in government in Singapore. But the question I always ask is, how can I help you? Life is about win-win, right? Life is about win-win. I'm not going to get something unless I give you something. And maybe that's because when I was a government official, I used to get annoyed when people come pitch me ideas, and it's all about them, right? And I say, I get it, but I'm a government. I'm going to give you help, be it money or be it, relaxing a regulation, because Singapore gets something in return. And so I always tell my guys, we deal with all sorts of governments on all sorts of matters. Sometimes we're trying to get a grant to do something. Sometimes we're trying to push for a policy to be liberalized so that we can do something else. But I always tell them, hey, start with the question, how can I help Singapore? How can I help Indonesia? How can I help China, right? And then let's start from there, right? And I will tell you that one thing in our business that's pretty unique is there is one thing that cuts across all these countries, which is building local heroes. We are actually in the business of building local heroes. You know, our company mission is not, you know, to stage the best fights, right? Our company mission is to unleash real-life superheroes that ignite the world with hope, strength, dreams, and inspiration. The same way people need, you know, access to transportation, the same way people need access to goods and services online. People need heroes. People need other people that look like them most of the time. You know, we're all human, we're tribal, that they can look up to. Yao Ming ignited China. He was always a great basketball player, but he only really ignited China when he went to the NBA, because that was when he was on a global stage. So local heroes on a global stage. In every one of these countries, we are discovering Yao Mings. We're discovering Manny Pacquiao's. We're discovering Li Na's, right? Because we're doing this, you know, on a pretty large scale across Asia. And we work with many governments to build these heroes up. I'll give you an example. Ong La, you know, he is a Myanmarese athlete. He's one of our world champions. He's Myanmar's great life story, very inspiring life story. He fled Myanmar when he was with his family as refugees during the war days, grew up in the US, came back as our athlete. And he has ignited an entire country because Myanmar never had a world champion in any sports league until he came along. When we have shows in Myanmar and he fights, at its peak, 9 out of 10 TVs is tuned into our fight, right? And you know, people say he may run for president someday, but it is someone like him that gives people a beacon of hope, right? Because if someone like him, a former refugee, can sit on a world stage and be a world champion, you know, I think people find a lot of inspiration in that. I will make one more point, just sort of, and Swan Gin didn't pay me to say this, but you know, having worked in the Singapore, I will say this, and I'll make it brief. But sometimes governments, we always assume this sort of, you know, semi sort of adversarial relationship with governments. You know, are you going to relax this thing? Are you going to license this? I'll tell you what. Sometimes governments actually are the entrepreneur. In the case of Singapore in 2008, Singapore staged the first ever Formula One race at night, and the first ever real city street circuit after Monaco, which was 40, 50 years earlier. The government actually played an entrepreneurial role in making that happen. It teamed up with a local businessman called Mr. Ong, and you know, they jointly did the deal with the Formula One franchisors in the UK. It broke a lot of records in terms of viewership, in terms of being a first, you know, for the Formula One franchise. And that was a project that the government actually was the entrepreneur in. Sometimes governments don't just regulate, they actually do it.
Well, let me ask you, Swan Gin. Hua Fung mentioned local heroes as individuals. Ming mentioned local champions as companies. How do you as EDB balance between going after fans and bringing Facebook and Google to establish themselves and their APEC headquarters in Singapore versus building up those local champions and local heroes?
No, I think we are very clear that yes, it's great to have local champions, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we let the market work. And why? There are at least two reasons, right? You want the efficiency, and you want the discipline that markets impose on companies. I think the minute governments get into the business of picking which company is going to win, then you're going to lose this discipline. So I think on our part, we will do what's necessary to help potential local companies, local entrepreneurs succeed. You know, make sure that the underlying operating environment is great, but we will stop short of trying to pick the company that's going to win, because we do want the markets to work. So that's a very deep-held philosophy of the Singapore government.
We are almost out of time already. This conversation honestly could go on for a couple more hours, to the chagrin, I'm sure, of the panelists. But I do want to throw out one last question and ask for a very quick answer from each of our panelists about growth, which we are barely touching on, and that is my fault for not having managed the time properly. What is an area of growth in Asia that you believe is extremely important that might be surprising to the audience here? So I want to go down the line from Hua Fung all the way to Swan Gin. Just short answer from each of you. What is an area of growth in Asia or a specific Asian country that you think is important but could be surprising to the room?
I think for me, the very interesting thing is, we talk a lot about Asia being an end market, right, for goods and services. In our business, Asia is a producer of IP, right? We are producing content in Asia that we're exporting to the world. And if you think about it, that's actually quite recent, right? Asia has been a net importer of content, be it entertainment, be it sports, from the West. And now it's kind of our turn to make stuff to export to the rest of the world. You see with BTS, right? Korean, the biggest boy band in the world now is Korean, it's BTS, right? So it starts with BTS, we're doing it in sports, and we're gonna hopefully see a lot more IP coming out of Asia that's for world consumption.
Excellent. Teddy?
I think for Indonesia, it's actually quite simple. It's financial inclusion and be part of it, right? Because the moment that, it's a country with 115 banks, believe it or not, but yet it has like over half the population being unbanked. Find a way, like what I think a lot of the startups are doing in Indonesia, like ourselves, find a way to get that, be part of that financial inclusion to help people to come into the financial service level. It doesn't have to be an official banking system. It can be in any measure, from e-money ranges to P2P. The moment you crack that, then you'll actually tap into literally Indonesia is probably the blue oceans. 95% of the population that are not yet touching a lot of some of this technology, right? And you are talking about 260 million people. If you tap into like a big chunk of them, that's by default is the blue ocean.
Ming?
I'll reinforce Teddy's point. I think it's financial inclusion plus the informal economy and making the informal economy formal, number one. Number two, you can do it profitably, both for consumers, but then also for companies that are addressing the underlying problems in the right way.
Tony?
So I think the total innovation in transportation system, including 5G, i.e. in the future you consider you have autonomous driving in a 5G network together with high-speed train. There are several things which are unique currently in the China market. That one will surprise the world. How will they combine together have some eco-chemical reaction together? That one will surprise the world.
And Swan Gin?
I agree with all the views that were expressed earlier. I would be specific to the internet economy because I think that's an area that one can enter quite easily. Because if you look at the gross merchandise value, GMV as a percentage of GDP, in Southeast Asia it's only about 2.7% or so. In the US it's about 6.5%. It's a tremendous growth opportunity. And within that, online travel, e-commerce, online media, the likes of One Championship, and of course ride-hailing and ride-sharing.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've barely scratched the surface. I hope that this will actually lead to many more conversations. I certainly hope that all of you guys are increasingly curious about what's going on in Asia. Thank you so much for your time. Please give a hand to all of our panelists.